Stalin's legacy is suspended because of the Ukraine war. World War II ended when Field Marshal Wilhelm von Keitel signed the unconditional surrender in Berlin in the presence of Allied commanders. The Nazi commanders signed the surrender agreement on May 8, 1945, but that moment coincided with May 9 Moscow time. For this reason, Central and Western European countries have been celebrating Victory Day on May 8, the anniversary of the surrender agreement. However, most of Russia and other post-Soviet countries celebrate Victory Day on May 9. This holiday has great significance for Russia because in the Second World War, the Nazis showed their most barbaric faces in Eastern Europe. In addition, while even the whole of France surrendered to the Nazis within 15 days, the Soviet Union took on the whole attack of the Nazis and played the biggest role in the defeat of Nazi Germany in the end. For this reason, the Kremlin administration attaches special importance to the May 9th Victory Day. Eid celebrations begin weeks or even months in advance in Russia. Now Russia is canceling the Victory Day celebrations for security reasons in some cities in Russia. The scope of the May 9th Victory Day ceremonies will be narrowed. Victory Day celebrations in Russia were canceled due to security concerns across the country, according to Russian officials. The decision was taken by the Kremlin amid concerns that the incident could turn into an opportunity for pro-Ukrainian forces to cause chaos. But some critics expressed fears that Vladimir Putin's celebrations could turn into a show of opposition to his war against Ukraine. The Russian army demonstrates its strength with the weapons in its inventory during the celebrations. That Victory Day attaches great importance to in the Immortal Regiment March held as part of the celebrations. People from all over the country are marching with photographs of their relatives lost in the Second World War. Russian President Vladimir Putin walked with a photograph of his father in uniform at the ceremony in Moscow last year. Deputy Yelena Kaneva from the ceremony committee announced last month that this year's Immortal Regiment March will be held in other formats for security reasons. According to the announcement on the Immortal Regiment website, relatives of those who lost their lives in the Second World War can put their photos on the windows of their cars, have them printed on their clothes, or use them as social media avatars. Some commentators attributed the cancellation of the Immortal Regiment to Russia's losses in Ukraine. According to Dmitry Koltsov, an editor of an independent news website and now living in exile, people would likely have come to the event with portraits of their deceased relatives in Ukraine if the march had not been cancelled. According to Koltsov, the number of photos to be moved would be uncomfortably large. Former Siberian television editor Viktor Mukhnik, who is also in exile, also claimed that the Russian state is more concerned about the damage to its own image than a hypothetical terrorist attack. The photograph of those who died in the Ukrainian war, not those who died 80 years ago during the March of the Immortal Regiment, would dominate, Mukhnik said. This reveals a hidden dimension of the disaster. In the meantime, it stated that the parade, which is watched with interest all over the world where the Russian army exhibits its equipment on the Red Square, will be closed to the public this year. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Petrov stated that Russian intelligence services are working to ensure the security of the ceremony against terrorist attacks. In the past few days, fires broke out at two different fuel storage facilities in an area in southern Russia and in Russia's annexed Crimea. This week, two separate explosions derailed freight trains in the Bryansk region on the border with Ukraine, and power lines were blown up in the Leningrad region. Ukraine has not claimed responsibility for any of these attacks. However, Ukrainian military officials said that damaging Russia's logistics capacity was part of Kiev's long-awaited counterattack preparation. A series of explosions and fires is causing great turmoil in Russia. This chaos environment worries Vladimir Putin a lot. The Russian leader finds the solution to cancel the parades, but the waters in Moscow do not calm down. The attacks carried out by drones in Moscow increased the tension in the city. Video has emerged showing a drone attacking the dome of Chernetsky Dvorets in the Kremlin. Russian officials claim that the building was attacked by Ukraine and they promised retaliation. Ukrainian President Zelensky denied that Kiev was involved in the attack. The video shows the drone approaching the dome and then exploding like a fireball, lighting up the sky. It seems that this drone did not hit the dome itself, however, it exploded very close to the dome, causing debris to fall into the dome. The two drones are expected of attacking the dome in a row. Photos from another video show two drone strikes, one at 2:27 am and the other at 2:43. According to the Yakimon Telegram channel, residents of Moscow state that the sound of the explosion can be heard on the opposite side of the Moscow River. According to Yakima, the power of the explosion was like thunder. In addition, Putin's press service blamed Kiev for the attacks, which could be seen as a great symbolic victory for Ukraine, especially before the May 9th Victory Day. There is hardly a higher profile target than the Kremlin. On the other hand, this explosion could also be used to support Putin's war efforts and to bring the Russians together. This has already led to speculation that this was a calculated move by Russia. The video shows people climbing the tower just before one of the drones exploded. In this case, it raises doubts about exactly how all this happened. The official presidential press service of Russia claimed that the Kiev regime attempted to attack the residence of the president of the Russian Federation in the Kremlin with a drone. The press service said in a statement that two drones targeted the Kremlin. Timely intervention of the army and special services, which included radar systems, disabled the devices. The drones crashed into Kremlin territory without causing any casualties or damage, the press service reported. The Kremlin administration considers these actions as an assassination attempt on the president. Vladimir Putin was not harmed by this terrorist attack. Putin's work program has not changed and continues as usual. Russia reserves the right to take countermeasures whenever and wherever it sees fit. But Mikhail Podolyak, an advisor to the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, denied that Kiev was involved. Podolyak stated in a tweet that Russia was openly preparing a large-scale terrorist attack. For this reason, Russia first detains a large group in Crimea, which is allegedly destructive. It then shows drones over the Kremlin. First of all, Ukraine is waging a purely defensive war and not attacking, Podolyak said. What are the targets on the territory of the Russian Federation for? This does not solve any military problems, but it gives the Russian Federation justification for its attacks on civilians. Podolyak comment that Ukraine did not attack Russian territory is also misleading because we have repeatedly reported numerous incidents in which Russian towns along the border and targets beyond were attacked in various ways. Regardless of who is to blame, Russia predicted some kind of attack on its capital in January by installing a pantsir defense system over at least two different government buildings in Moscow, including the Defense Ministry headquarters. We do not currently know what types of drones are involved or where they were launched from, but Ukraine has had other obvious attempts to strike near Moscow. Ukrainian drones have come closer and closer to the capital in recent months. On April 24th, a Ukrainian drone loaded with explosives, most likely a J-22, was found a short distance from Moscow. Also in February, a Ukrainian drone crashed within 112 kilometers of Moscow. As a result, the Ukrainian war began to affect Russian cities and important celebrations. It's a matter of curiosity how Vladimir Putin will react to the attacks that suspend Stalin's legacy. Follow us to be informed instantly about the developments between Kiev and the Kremlin. After an unbreakable series of defeats in Vuhledar, the Russians have collected one more assault unit to conduct yet another massive attack in an attempt to breach one of the most important points on the Ukrainian defense line and cause a devastating chain reaction. But an early arrival in rainy season has finally put an end to the Russian winter campaign. Last time I told you that the Russians started transferring a lot of troops and equipment from Mariupol to Vuhledar because their forces starting losing their combat capability due to extensive losses. I also told you that the Ukrainians have conducted a series of preemptive strikes on Russian bases in Mariupol to ensure that the relocated formations will not arrive full and ready. Yesterday, Ukrainian Mariupol mayoral advisor claimed that certain Russian formations previously deployed within the Russian rear have arrived at the Vuhledar front. Nonetheless, the intensity of fights in this region has not increased. Instead, a video was released where a Russian commander showed the landscape in close proximity to Vuhledar and explained why it did not allow the Russians to breach Ukrainian defense despite having more manpower and equipment. He got on the local hill and showed how easy it is to control the villages in the lowlands. He said that the difference in elevation near Vuhledar is even more extreme, and because the Ukrainians have a lot of cameras and drones, they can quickly and precisely correct artillery fire, which makes attacking from the lowlands awfully difficult. He also described the situation near the coal mines and said that in this case, even though they are almost at the same elevation, this small hill serves as natural fortifications that are almost impossible to approach. Around 2 weeks ago, the Russians started complaining about the ineffective use of artillery and aviation and asked the high command to erase the high-rise buildings in Vuhledar with big caliber shells. Over the last week, the Russians have increased their fire on Vuhledar in order to disperse their fire. The Ukrainians have launched a series of counterattacks, but it looks like the Russians already got fixated on the city itself. The latest report suggests that the Russians started using 203 and 240mm squared caliber artillery and even long-range missiles like Kar-59I in order to level the city with the ground. Russian sources are saying that several high-rise buildings are already down. However, this information remains unconfirmed at this time. There are several things that the Ukrainians can do. Firstly, they can boost air defense in this region to prevent the Russians from using long-range missiles and aviation. And secondly, they can increase air reconnaissance in the region and concentrate their efforts on effective counter-battery fire. For now, it looks like the Russians decided to put their offensive operation on hold and destroy all the obstacles with their artillery and aviation before making a second attempt to breach Ukrainian defense. Somewhere in late April, globally speaking, the Russian offensive operation has failed. The Russians plan to capture the whole Luhansk region by spring so that they could start dealing with Sloviansk and Kramatorsk during the late spring or summer operation. In order to achieve it, they tried to disperse Ukrainian troops by penetrating their defense in Vuhledar, finishing the encirclement of Bakhmut to shorten the front line and freeing up some troops and crossing the Roberts River in front of Kreminna. However, they failed to achieve each of these tactical goals, let alone the whole operation, because their time is up. Today, positive temperatures and rains finally came to the whole eastern front. It will continue to rain for at least several days each week, so offensive actions will become much more difficult by the time the rainy season ends. The Ukrainians will be ready for a counter-offensive operation, so it looks like the Russians have missed their best chance to achieve operation-level success. With the motivation and achievements it has achieved, the Ukrainian armed forces is hitting the Russian trenches harder at every step and winking at a greater success. With each passing day, Putin continues his efforts to renew his demoralized and worn-out army. He appeals to his allies for this, but we see that his allies who would voluntarily help Putin leave him one by one. Undoubtedly, Belarus is the most strategic of Putin's allies. However, there are serious disagreements between Lukashenko and Putin. At the same time, there are great disagreements and differences of opinion between the Russian army and the Belarusian army. While Lukashenko advocates a ceasefire in Ukraine and non-involvement in the war there, Putin acts in the opposite direction, infuriating the Belarusian people and army. Lukashenko is making rhetoric that Putin did not expect, and the Belarusian people seem to support Ukraine in essence. Lukashenko may be trying to save his own regime by acting in this way. Who knows? Likewise, the Belarusian people and the army are against both Lukashenko and Putin. In particular, the internal conflicts of Russian soldiers and Belarusian officers stationed on Belarusian territory, as well as the blowing up of Russian military bases, barracks, and airports in Belarus by Belarusian anti-war groups support this. A major confrontation between Belarusian and Russian troops threatens to break out due to the uncontrolled tension between the soldiers of both armies. Russian officers consider themselves superior to Belarusians, and this sometimes turns into verbal and physical fights between the army officers. At the moment, we see that the Ukrainian armed forces are on alert, especially at all the borders with Belarus in the north. Vladimir Putin is obviously very confident in a plan that he will carry out through Belarus. But when we look at the relationship between the Belarusian army and the Russian army, we see that this is not that easy because the Belarusian people and their army want to stay away from the war in the background, and they don't seem to like the Russian army giving orders to them. I always say that I prefer to work alone rather than an uncontrolled and uncoordinated cooperation. The Russian and Belarusian armies somehow got along well so far, but there is no coordination between them. It will definitely be to the advantage of Ukraine if they make a move in this way. However, tensions are reportedly escalating between the Russians and their Belarusian hosts, threatening to escalate into a major conflict. This could be a devastating blow for Putin's army. Sources indicate that Russian soldiers infuriated their Belarusian counterparts by using ethnically charged insults against them. The tension between the armies of the two states is also increasing in Belarus. Numerous conflict situations are connected with precedents of the contemptuous attitude of the Russian army towards Belarusians. The Belarusian military police cannot rein in the illegal behavior of the Russians. In particular, reports submitted by Russian senior officers based on the complaints of their own soldiers shows the derogatory expression and behavior of Russians towards Belarusians. The precedents for these events are growing rapidly, leading to an uncontrolled escalation of tensions in Belarus. Other reports indicate that a growing number of Belarusian officers are dissatisfied with their country's political military leadership because of the possibility of getting involved in Putin's war. We talked about this in the past days. We know that some Belarusian officers left their posts and joined the war in Ukraine. At the same time, many Belarusian soldiers support them at the front for the just struggle of Ukraine. It is stated that thousands of Belarusian soldiers fled from Belarus and joined the Ukrainian armed forces to fight against the Russian army. At this point, let's take an excerpt from an interview with a Belarusian soldier who fought at the front in Ukraine. The Belarusian soldier says that he will do his best to get Ukraine out of the unjust Russian occupation as soon as possible, and that they will start a rebellion against Lukashenko in Belarus. After their work in Ukraine is finished, the Russian army regularly sends troops to its neighbor as it continues to strengthen its presence in Ukraine. Russia, which has been doing this for a long time, declared in the updates it has carried out a military exercise in Belarus. According to the latest intelligence reports, about 12,000 Russian soldiers have been deployed to Belarus. Ukrainian military intelligence also claimed in September that Lukashenko was preparing to house as many as 20,000 mobilized Russian troops. Russian troops are currently being trialed by Belarusian military trainers at the 230th Combined Arms Abuse Lesnevsky training ground in Brest. It appears that Lukashenko is increasingly under pressure to send troops to Ukraine and is preparing to deploy his army. The Belarusian army is believed to have enlisted 10,000 soldiers in the fall, and there have been reports recently that Belarusian doctors have received their calling papers. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, the steps to prepare for war caused a reaction among parts of Lukashenko's army due to the threat of dragging the republic. There is growing dissatisfaction with the activities of the military and political leadership of Belarus among the border service soldiers and the armed forces of this country. Lukashenko has been receiving a serious reaction from his own people for his involvement in the Ukraine war in his last term. We are sure that Putin would have liked Lukashenko to be more involved, But I don't think Lukashenko wants to do that. This would be one of his biggest mistakes because Lukashenko barely survived the anti-government protests when he became the head of Belarus for the 6th time in 2020. And the war is less popular even among pro-Russians. In the end, they have no desire to be the cannon fodder for Putin or Lukashenko, even at the beginning of the war. Only 28% of Belarusians supported Russian attacks, while today this figure has dropped to 11%. The Russian army has been periodically attacking from the north, that is, through Belarus, and attempts to infiltrate the Kremlin announced its 1.5 million troop plan and unlimited funding for the war in Ukraine. 147,000 soldiers joined the Russian army with Putin's silent mobilization policy. In addition, thousands of soldiers and ammunition were deployed to Belarus. The Russian army may carry out a sudden Kiev operation through Belarus to relieve the Eastern Front and replenish its ammunition and troop supply. 12,000 of the newly mobilized soldiers received their first training in Russian camps in Belarus and are now preparing to be sent to the Ukrainian fronts. The strategic importance of Belarus, which is intended to be used in another Kiev raid in 2023, is enormous. But Putin has a very serious problem to solve. While tensions have exploded due to ethnic insults in recent days, Russian and Belarusian soldiers came to the brink of civil war. Sources indicate that the Russian soldiers infuriated their Belarusian counterparts by using ethnically charged insults against them. Belarus played an important facilitator role in the Russian offensive against Kiev from February 24, 2022. However, it's unlikely that the Belarusian and Russian troops conducting these exercises will now form a force capable of launching a successful new attack on northern Ukraine. Because in the Kiev attack that started on February 24, 2022, Ukraine slapped them very hard and the damage of the slap still remains. Belarus was used as a launch pad in Russia's first offensive. However, the Ukrainian armed forces is much more prepared. This time, the threat from Belarus could end. The Belarusians' logical invasion routes, a mine death trap, and already defended Ukrainians know what to expect next time. They are preparing for another attack in the north with an entire army. Russian troops appear to be extremely reluctant compared to highly motivated Ukrainian soldiers. We know how much of a business-changing factor morale is on the battlefield. Belarusian soldiers are also aware of this crisis situation in the Russian army, and they think that Russia no longer sees the motivation to win. Looking at the history of Russia, the cost of losing a war is regime change. But Vladimir Putin has managed to preserve his regime so far. This is the main reason why Putin did not end the war, because he has nothing to lose anymore. Since the Putin regime has failed to renew its forces since its mobilization order in early September, launching an early new front will inevitably result in a retreat. Despite Russia's dwindling forces, Ukrainian military officials have sounded the alarm bells warning of a new invasion in the north of the country. Putin can put his last trump card on the table, and if he loses this one, he will have lost everything.